Housman. I am CEO of Children and Families Across Borders. There are three things that I thought would be helpful to highlight from the initial assessment guide. The first being some of the legal requirements around facilitating an international placement and the initial assessments that feed into those placements, as well as the sources of support that are available. The second being around how to actually obtain those initial assessments, and then finally some of the practical considerations that social workers will need to take into account when working in an international context. To address the first point around the legal requirements of facilitating an international placement, some sources of support, the first thing that has to be underscored is really understanding the citizenship of the child that you're working with. We've seen a lot of cases where citizenship is incorrectly captured, or not all of the citizenships are captured, and that will be instrumental in understanding whether or not a child can actually eventually be placed with family members abroad. It is also helpful if the child is a foreign national to involve the embassy. They may want to take part in some of the proceedings, and they certainly can assist in some of the initial assessments. In terms of sources of support, Children and Families Across Borders operates a free advice line for social workers. We give advice on over 120 countries around the world and help direct social workers to the best sources of support. We also offer a fee-based service on obtaining record checks, obtaining assessments abroad, and delivering post-placement services. If the family resides in a Hague Convention country and the country is a signatory, then there is a central authority that will be set up and will help with the recognition of court orders and will help facilitate cross-border child protection. In England, that central authority is the International Child Abduction and Contact Unit. And as I say, they can help facilitate obtaining reports abroad. The second item that I thought would be helpful to cover is the practicalities of obtaining an initial assessment abroad. So there are three main ways that this can be done. The first is a UK social worker may fly out to get that information, or may more practically call family members abroad to obtain initial information. Some considerations to take into account, particularly if UK social workers are considering flying abroad, is that the practice may be illegal. Social work profession is a regulated profession, and the social worker would need a work visa to obtain any information and to practice overseas. There are also considerations around whether the UK social worker has a good understanding of local support systems that are available in the country or local cultural practices that may be relevant in informing the care of the child. It also may be perceived as intrusive for a foreign social worker to be asking questions of a local family, particularly if that family is in a small village or a small community where perceptions matter a lot, and particularly if that initial assessment or full assessment ends up being negative of that family. The second way to obtain an initial assessment or a full assessment would be to work through a local assessor. That local assessor could be arranged through CFAB or the central authority, and they would be able to gather initial information or a full report on the family member, and obviously would have an understanding of local laws, cultural context, etc. The disadvantage of this could be that the time frame within which you get that report back may be much longer than the proceedings, the court proceedings. And it's quite important for social workers to be explicit about the type of information they want back, as we can't assume that social workers abroad have the same knowledge and training as UK social workers. So if there are particular areas of concern, if a child needs emotional support or mental health support, that needs to be quite explicit with the local assessor so they can investigate what options of support are available locally. The FRG template, the initial assessment template, is a great starting point, but of course every case and every child is different, so social workers need to think about what would be important to obtain in an international context. And then finally, social workers may want to consider a joint assessment or a split assessment. A joint assessment could be where a UK social worker works with the local assessor to gather information. So you have a UK trained social worker leading the investigation, but you also have a local assessor who can help supplement that with local information. A split assessment would be where a local assessor in the destination country gathers the information, and then the UK social worker flies the main carer, potential carer, to the UK to undertake their own assessment here in the UK. So one thing that's important to be aware of when obtaining information from abroad is that it takes much longer than you would expect it to in the UK. CFAB finds that to obtain a full assessment abroad takes around 61 days, so that's 9 weeks. So CFAB is happy to help with either obtaining assessments from local assessors abroad or with facilitating joint or split assessments. We're quite pleased to say that where we have undertaken assessments abroad, we have a placement rate of around 1 in 2. So placements definitely can be successful, and you can look at placing children with families internationally, but there's a lot of extra considerations to take into account. The final thing that I wanted to touch on was some of those practical considerations in facilitating placing a child with family members abroad. So one of the things that will need to be taken into account is the fact that the placement hasn't been tested. Here in the UK, we try to make sure that those placements have been tested before looking at placing a child, for example, on a special guardianship order. That's not possible in an international context. Courts have tried to get around this in some ways by using interim care orders or making the child a ward of court. However, there are complications around where the jurisdiction ends once that child is actually in the destination country. And I think it's quite